Hey there, I'm Dr. Amy King, and this podcast is The Most Important Medicine. If you're a physician, where we learn about trauma-informed medicine and ways to build resilience in healthcare organizations. We do this through your stories and stories of other professionals. We listen to each other to transform medicine with compassion and curiosity about what it means to be a trauma-informed practice or provider. Every time you join me, I want you to learn practical information and leave with tangible tools that you can use with patients right away. Today, I'm talking with an incredible guest, Tabitha Jensen. Tabitha is the Deputy Director for New Avenues for Youth. New Avenues for Youth is a Portland-based nonprofit organization dedicated to the prevention and intervention of youth homelessness. They focus on the individual, their experiences, identities, needs, and goals, and help youth make positive changes in their lives. Tabitha has nearly 30 years of experience working in positions of nonprofit, government, and corporate environments, including most recently her tenure as president for Oregon Public Health Association. I met Tabitha through Oregon Echo Network and her work in youth with youth in foster care. So Tabitha, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks, Amy. A few other things I might say that I feel like define me or are part of how I introduce myself. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. I identify as an individual who lives with neurodivergence, specifically ADHD. And I'm also a former at-risk youth. I dropped out of high school at age 16 and moved out of my family home soon thereafter, and have some mirrored lived experiences of the young people that I work with.
Wow. And I'm sure that makes a huge difference in your work with them.
It does. It does. Although I often say that the lived experience is the secret sauce, but it needs to be tempered with you having done your own work first before you step into helping fields, because in the cases where folks haven't done their work first, it can actually be a recipe for disaster.
That is so true. So let's dive right in there. That's perfect, because I think often what I'm asking people is, how did you get interested in this work? And you're saying I had my own lived experience. So you have passion around helping youth.
Yeah.
So tell us more first about how you got interested in the work that you do and why doing your own work before you enter into it is so important.
Yeah, my path, I think, organically and very luckily did not begin in the nonprofit or clinical or helping world. As I mentioned, I dropped out of high school at 16. Luckily, I had developed quite a few skills that were usable in the job field. I knew how to type. I felt comfortable working in computer environments, even though this was early 90s. So I was working in banking and finance for most of the early stage of my career, and then went back to school eventually in my mid-20s. And once I started studying particularly privilege and oppression concepts, and better understanding that a lot of the work I was doing in consumer banking and mortgage banking was actually fairly predatory and not something that I wanted to continue on, I ended up pivoting and moving into HIV services. And my first 7 years in nonprofit were working for an AIDS service organization in Seattle. So during that time, I was also embarking on my own personal transformation through cognitive behavioral therapy, and just really getting a handle on some of my own childhood trauma and things that needed to be unpacked and addressed, kind of making some amends with family. And then I eventually moved back into the space where I was interested in working with at-risk youth that had lives similar to the one that I lived when I was a teenager. So again, it was not really my choice, it was more organic. And through that, I really came to see and understand that many times younger folks that were stepping into helping careers that had closer proximity to some of those childhood traumas and had the lived experience were actually really struggling with things that they were already ill-equipped to juggle, particularly around things like self-concept, personal boundary setting, and just their affect regulation. And so I think that's one of the things that's especially very dicey in the current push right now for a lot of peer services. I think peer services are wonderful. They have their origins in the recovery communities. We know that people who can say from a place of true understanding, I've been where you are, and I know that there's a way out. incredibly powerful. However, I do feel like there's still a long way for us to go relative to setting some structure and good supervision and almost that professional unpacking through, group check-ins with staff. I feel like there's a lot of work that we do in helping professions where we're not properly supporting one another or encouraging folks to do that work outside. Because if you haven't had that natural experience in your own therapeutic journey, you do a lot of parallel process, or you actually do harm, which no one intends to do, but it happens a lot.
Okay, so you went from banking to doing your own work and kind of back into the work with youth, because you felt like you weren't going to be ready to work with youth until you had kind of, work through your own process. And I really appreciate what you're saying about, peer-based work, which is so powerful. And as you know, a lot of my listeners for this podcast are physicians and healthcare professionals who, people go into helping professions because they want to help, and often because they were hurt, right? And they want to do better. So what would you say to encourage someone to do that work before they dive back into the deep end?
Yeah, some of this is hard because I feel like it almost takes, it's difficult to learn or coach, but in whatever way a person can have kind of an inner monologue of constant self-reflection, I think that's one of the key pieces, is knowing yourself and knowing your own triggers, knowing your own motivations. I've had a number of experiences where I'm coaching caseworkers or youth advocates that are a little bit newer in their work, and they're approaching a particular situation in a particular way and are not even kind of looking for the breadcrumbs as to why they're approaching a particular situation or even like a job. And I think especially, as a white person doing this work, always trying to be as mindful as possible around equity impacts and considerations, even having awareness of concepts of white saviorism, or especially when we're talking about social work or therapeutic approaches, there's just such deep basis of white supremacy and control in a lot of these realms. And so I think it's the reflection of like, what is my personal motivation? What's my worldview of how this person should be receiving help from me? I can even embarrassingly admit, when I first stepped into work as a housing case manager, I went through a 6-month period where I was actually really frustrated because a lot of the folks I was helping didn't express thanks very often, and very naive. And again, I'm embarrassed, but I think it's a good thing to reflect back to where I was at that point, that I just didn't have that humility yet of understanding that if someone was able to invite me in to be someone to help them at a point where they were that vulnerable, like that wasn't what I should be there for. I shouldn't be there for that thank you. It should be just kind of without expectation. So that's a long way of saying, I think self-reflection is super important, and just constantly looking at the why. And I don't know, even though it is such a powerful draw into work, if the primary only reason is because you're, trying to pay it forward because of a family member that's had a particular challenge, or even yourself, that isn't always necessarily the best reason to get into a particular field. And I've seen a number of people actually very healthily decide that they're going to pivot and do something a little bit different. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't help other humans, but maybe in something that isn't quite as tapped into this specific thing. Like if you had experienced being trafficked as a young person, maybe doing work with sexually exploited or domestic violence impacted persons might not be the best approach. Maybe instead doing work with, gerontology and helping people as they age, something that isn't quite so tapped into your own personal trauma.
Yeah, because I think otherwise, and what you see, and definitely what I see, I'm sure, is people are kind of reliving their trauma if they're not also taking care of that and haven't done the really important work that everybody deserves to receive, which is their own work around trauma.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing is, even as a deputy director who has moved through very um, different levels of management and responsibility, I even find today sometimes if I get pulled into one of our residential programs or the drop-in center to help with coverage in a pinch, I will sometimes come up against a young person that is a mirror reflection of myself when I was 15. And while that young person is often the young person I am most drawn to go spend time with, I also know that that's the young person I should be friendly to and help if they need a quick question answered, but I should actually let someone else step into deeper relationship because of the fact that I probably will be too triggered because of that kind of shadow memory of myself.
Oh, this is so important. So, for instance, a lot of like medical leaders or organizational leaders might listen to this and think, okay, how do I have that conversation with a young resident or a newly practicing nurse or psychologist or healthcare worker to say, this work is really important, but maybe over here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Do you have a way that you start those conversations, Tabitha?
I think a lot of times I had this moment, a coworker of mine years ago kind of revealed this thing that I think comes naturally to a lot of people, but it felt mind blowing to me at the time. That when I wasn't sure about something, to just ask the question back to the person. And again, it feels very simple, but for whatever reason, it just wasn't something that came naturally to me. I always wanted to have the answers.
Mhm.
And I think particularly when you're stepping into a more sensitive conversation, especially because if someone is drawn to work because of something personal, that's going to be a very sensitive topic if you're stepping into conversation to reflect back to someone that they may need to dive more deeply, or possibly you may have some specific constructive feedback for the person. And so I think I would just start, and I have started conversations like that with reflection back of, what feels meaningful to you about this? Is there a particular reason why? Tell me more about that. And then if they do start revealing something that has more personal connection, asking some questions about, is that something that you've ever actually unpacked in a more therapeutic setting? Do you think it's possible you could be experiencing some transference or parallel processing? And again, I'm not a clinician, so I've learned those terms through the years from coaching and learning from other folks, both clinicians and non-clinicians, but they are some very fundamental concepts around almost kind of selfishly taking space away from a human you're helping
Mm.
as part of your own process. And again, I've rarely seen it be intentional, but it is kind of diminishing that person's experience because you're using it as part of your own experience.
I mean, like I'm writing this down like feverishly because okay, so let's try it out. So
Yeah.
the people that are listening, I'll out myself here, Tabitha, and say, okay, so I'm a person who grew up with a dad that was an alcoholic, right? And now we'll pretend that's actually true, but we'll
Yeah.
pretend I'm going into medicine and I'm saying to you as my supervisor or, more veteran colleague, I think I'd really like to practice addiction medicine
Yeah.
because I don't want kids to grow up like I grew up.
Yeah. So I would probably approach someone like you asking, tell me a little bit more about, is there something when you were initially in school that really drew you to that particular specialization? Or is there something more personal that you're connected to that's kind of luring you into that? What's feeling like the real impetus right now?
Yeah. And I would honestly, in that moment, probably say, I grew up with a dad who was an alcoholic and felt really abandoned by him. And I want to make a difference in that world. I want to make a difference in that space.
Yeah. So that is always, a personal connection can be such a strong motivator and can be that secret sauce. And I'd just be curious to know, is this something that you've really processed, any childhood trauma or adult trauma that you've had as a result of this relationship with your father who's had addiction issues? Do you think that that's something that might come up in treating other humans? Because it's possible that you've gotten really great therapeutic supports and you feel like that's something that you have a great handle on. But what do you think? Where would you say you are right now as far as your own personal journey with that.
Oh my gosh, I hope right now, I'm just going to pause for a second. If you're listening to this, y'all are getting free reflective supervision tips from Tabitha, because this is exactly the questions we need to be asking people that we're supervising, young people in medicine, young people in healthcare in general, and in all fields, because, and it goes back to what Tabitha just said, I wrote it down, we may be selfishly taking away space from another person. I think in my program, we actually had to do therapy, like to unpack our crap, literally, right?
Yeah.
So that we weren't projecting it onto people. But I don't think that happens in many fields. And actually, like somebody had to sign off on me, right? Like Amy is okay to do this work, and she's kind of processed all of her stuff, and as much as a human can at that time, right? Because I think it's a continual journey. But I love that you're saying, right, we have to recognize why we're doing the work, ask ourselves these hard questions about, is it getting in the way? Because ultimately, whatever your lived experience may be, there may be somebody, who is relying on your help or support or resource that, if essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we're in the way of that, they won't get that help.
Well, and again, I've never seen it happen from a place of malice.
Mm-hmm.
It's that real need. I think if we are taking on the responsibility of helping others, it's almost the Hippocratic oath. Is that how you pronounce it? To do no harm. That isn't just in the sense of physical harm. We need to think about doing no harm emotionally, psychically. I really think for any person that's going to be in space with or put hands on another person through primary care, dental care, even, I think sometimes people forget putting hands and devices in mouths, especially if a young person has had sexual trauma. So loaded, so complicated. But even with behavioral health, like I think we really owe it. The program you were in, it sounds like, had it right. I feel like people should be doing a full assessment of their lives to almost kind of itemize what could be something that would come up that I'm not even thinking about. What is something that, did you have a sibling pass away of a disease when you were in your childhood? Have you gone through a really challenging divorce because of addiction? Like what is something that you should have kind of on your dashboard that could send you an alert signal almost when you're running up against a person you're serving, where you might say, you know what, probably not the best person for this. I'm going to hand you off to my partner. And sometimes, yeah.
Well, you know what I love about what you're saying, right? Like when you say put it on a dashboard, go through the checklist. What are all the things that could put, what you're doing in saying that, Tabitha, is you're normalizing that we've all had traumatic experiences of varying degrees, and certainly some people much more than others. And we have to be aware of it. Like, let's just normalize talking about it and exploring it. I love the put it on a dashboard kind of thing, right? Like, let's just take an inventory of it, so that we know what's going to get in the way of our work and what we need to still resolve.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love thinking about it.
But I do believe, though, if you've done the work, really magical things can happen when you can step into those relationships with your clients, with coworkers, and when it's appropriate and making those personal disclosures isn't a violation of boundary. Yeah. Where you can share those experiences, and they can be, in some cases, life-changing, where someone feels seen and feels like they can actually take that wisdom and make it their own. But you got to do the work first, and you have to know what your limitations are, because again, even as someone who's been through many, many years of therapy, and I feel like I have a pretty good handle on my ability to self-reflect, there are still circumstances that can come up if I haven't had enough sleep, if I've had something recent that's really challenging happen that's making me feel a little bit more raw, just where I know to just have that constant self-reflection and pick up on signals from myself that I need to be a little bit more careful.
Yeah, agree. So that's a good pivot into, if you've done the work, then you'll be able to really create some magic. Talk to us about what you do now.
What I do now, well, in my current job, I work pretty closely with teams that are providing a range of services for young people. We at New Avenues provide residential services, drop-in services for youth who are experiencing houselessness. We work with youth who've been sexually trafficked and exploited, independent living programs, case management for youth aging out of foster care, and we also have job training and education programming. So kind of soup to nuts, all of the preventative and basic needs services that a young person might experience. And, you know, so much of that requires the ability to build deep relationship with young people. And that's where that secondary trauma comes in as a practitioner, where as you build relationship and hear stories, you are hearing a lot of very sad things, things that will make you angry, things that make you frustrated, interfacing with a lot of systems that are very broken, child welfare, law enforcement, and yet systems that we have to work within because it's the best we have right now. And so I think that's a key reason why I'm constantly having to reflect on how I'm doing from day to day and how I'm showing up for the young person, is that if I'm not in the right headspace for them, if I'm either closed off or I'm oversharing, wherever on the spectrum I might fall, that will impact them. And if I don't show up right and they feel a disservice from how I'm showing up, I'm just one more adult in a line of many adults who have not shown up for them the way that they need it. So yeah, that's kind of my day to day.
So let me ask you a question about that. And I don't want to lose the last phrase that you just said about showing up for youth. You know, if you do it in a way that's compassionate and loving and kind of self-aware, but if you do it in another way, you're going to be another adult in a long line of adults that are disappointing this kid. So do most of the youth that you work with, do they have a primary care doctor or primary care team?
In some cases they do. It depends on what programs they're in. We worked really well with some care providers that were in the Every Step clinic system. That's a system in the Portland metro area that provides primary care for youth that are in foster care. The young people that are over the age of 18 or no longer in child welfare custody, it's a little bit more hit or miss. As you could imagine, the same, I think, as you'd find in most young people who see themselves as very healthy and not needing to see a provider very often. We're often running up against challenges with trying to make sure they have their vaccinations, or even that you're just getting annual wellness checkups. The good thing is that most of them are eligible for Medicaid, so we're able to enroll them in Oregon Health Plan. And access to care relative to eligibility isn't so much of a challenge, but actually trying to get them engaged with a provider that they see on a routine basis. I think just culturally that's challenging for a lot of the young people that come to New Avenues, because they tend to not come from cultures of preventative care. They're usually only going to a provider once something hurts badly enough or looks bad.
Yeah. So if I'm a physician and I am at a clinic or I work for a large organization, is there a way that I can be more welcoming, more accepting, more encouraging of youth to come and take care of themselves?
Yeah, I think creating trauma-informed spaces anywhere is always considering the different identities of the young people who are coming to receive services from you, especially those who are from the most marginalized communities, who may experience the most significant barriers in even wanting to trust in a space like that. I would always encourage folks to make sure they have lots of signage that affirms gender identity and sexuality, making sure folks know that pronouns will be used in a way that honor identities. Also, we always encourage iconography that represents the welcoming of all types of people, trying to have things in languages that are used most frequently in a community where you might live, at least signage also to make sure folks know where they can access translation services. But yeah, I think just taking into account, particularly in primary care, where I think there's always just so little time, and thinking about the fact that most of the young people we work with their trauma backgrounds, while they're very accustomed to quick transactional exchanges, that's not where they're going to open up the most quickly. And so if you happen to have awareness, or you can even build a relationship with providers to maybe have a block of time where a provider is scheduling appointments for a particular population, where you're able to take a little bit more time, or even work with a case manager in advance to find out if there's any circumstances or identities that you could kind of prepare to honor. I think those are potentially some good tips for how to get best outcomes, just because that, none of us like the quick 10-minute interaction with a physician or a provider, but particularly for a young person who maybe has experienced a lot of sexual abuse or trauma, those young people that may have been trafficked or exploited, so many different circumstances, young people that have been in the child welfare system for abuse, that have been subjected to examinations based on abuse that's happened to them. Those spaces don't feel safe. They feel very scary. Warming up the spaces as best you can, literally and figuratively, like having things like table warmers, fidgets that people can play with, just thinking of all the different ways that you can make a space feel a little bit more comfortable, even though, ultimately some people just don't like going to the doctor.
But here's the thing, you just now, I was kind of ticking it off as you were going through them, Tabitha, probably listed like almost 20 different things a physician or a clinic or an organization could do, even if they started with an inventory for themselves of what are we doing? What of those things are we not doing yet? And what could we do better or different? Maybe even inviting youth in to give feedback.
Absolutely. I always love that. Giving voice and actually asking the questions directly to the folks you're trying to impact, as opposed to it being a room of adults like us, who often can come up with some really good ideas. But I mean, to be honest with you, my true north is always thinking of my own stepdaughter, who's 25 this month, which makes my head explode. But when I think about the times when she's been the most afraid of something or had a difficult experience and had to, seek help from a particular facility, how would I want her to be supported in those spaces? And just thinking of every young person that comes through your doors as someone that you care about that deeply, your own child. If you don't have children, other close family members or someone else that you care for deeply, and how you would want them to be treated if they had to enter a space scared. I think anytime you personalize it, you can't help but care a little bit more deeply.
I agree. I love that. And so if you're listening, what I'm hearing from Tabitha is like, just reframe it for just a moment. Like if this was my niece, if this was my daughter or son or nephew, and they, especially if they've been through something difficult, felt marginalized, experienced depression on any level, how would I help them feel safe in this space? And any creative way that you could come up to do that is so appreciated. It's so appreciated. I mean, that's what I love about youth, is that they are so wonderfully accepting and appreciative of what we do when we try, and they know when an adult makes an effort, and they know when they're faking it.
Well, and don't ever assume that just because so many of them put up posture that they don't need anything and they're grown up, because unfortunately so many of them have had to grow up very quickly. I was one of those young people. I had to grow up very quickly. I put up a facade that I didn't want or need things that were still childlike. I cannot tell you how many, in some of our residential programs, how many 23-year-olds were the first to go grab a stuffy when we gave them new bedding and things for their new placement. And don't ever assume that something you're doing, be careful that you're not tokenizing or infantilizing, but having that stuff around and like having something that someone could squeeze. More often than not, they act cool, but once they're given a little bit of space, they love the stuff, because they often didn't get very long of a childhood. And so, yeah.
Oh gosh, you know what it reminds me of, Tabitha? I will never forget in my residency working with a young woman who had to grow up so quickly. And I was honored to work in this space with her. And she was 13 and she physically appeared about 18. And yet she had a Hello Kitty barrette in and a little purse and lip gloss, like a lip gloss roller. And I just thought, she's just a baby. She's just learning. And even though she looks and she's presenting like a much older person because she has to, like, I have to meet her where she's at and create safety. I don't know, is there a better way to say that? Because I think so many people who may listen to this, they see youth who may have a really troubled background, and they think, well, they're closed off, their arms are crossed when I walk in the room, they're not really interested, they're medically, we'll call it, I'm saying this in quotes, non-compliant, they're angry.
Yeah, the main thing I would say, especially because I would imagine most of your listeners are people who have spent a lot of time academically in science-based analysis. If your view of many young people who show up with behavioral complexities, especially those with childhood trauma, is any notion that it's by choice, go back and hit the books, because we know that trauma affects children's brains in a particular way that they have no control over. It affects their affect regulation, behavioral control, their impulse control. And I can guarantee you, from the hundreds, probably thousands of young people that I've worked with that are very complex in their behaviors and sometimes would be perceived to be aggressive or antisocial, more often than not, what you're seeing from them is a trauma response. It's not a willful act of aggression or violence. It is a response to stimuli that is reminding them in some way of past trauma that they've experienced, or they're just so anticipating something bad happening that they're going to strike first before something strikes them. And so yeah, I would say definitely dive into some deeper research on the cognitive impacts of a trauma.
I can't agree more. I mean, there's just every single behavior that I've ever seen, there's a reason for it.
Absolutely.
So as we're kind of pulling things to a close here, you had mentioned, being a professional and being aware of secondary trauma, secondary stress. Would you mind just defining for yourself what you mean by secondary trauma?
Sure. So secondary trauma is being in the presence of another person as they're either experiencing trauma or processing trauma, and you walk away from that experience, or in the moment as you're having that experience alongside them, you're actually taking on part of that trauma, although you're not the direct actor in the incident. A good example that I might use is, and unfortunately this happens more than I would like, we will have young people that use in our space, in our drop-in center, and we've had to use Narcan a number of times and actually treat someone who's overdosed in one of our restrooms. And it's an incredibly scary experience. We're always so grateful when it works. Thank goodness we have not had an experience yet where we lost a young person on premises, but the impact that has on the person who's helping them, even though we save them and everything is great, that adrenalization, the scariness of it, sometimes the secondary trauma that you experience in that moment can feel so immense, because the young person themselves may be so detached from what's going on and be disassociating from the intensity of it, that it almost feels like you're taking on more on their behalf. And so I think awareness of secondary trauma and making sure that you're finding ways to engage in self-care when you know that there's been that type of exposure is just so important, because it really, particularly if you have any past history that then also brings up parallel process, it can happen, both of those things at the same time, which is kind of like a sandwich of yuck. If you don't find a way to like shake that off and bubble bath it up that night, or whatever your chosen vice is for for healthy self-care. But yeah, it's basically being in proximity of trauma, even when you're doing it as a helper that has more control, plus depending on how woo-woo you are, I'm not terribly woo-woo, but I believe deeply in energy and energy transfer. And I think the energy you can be around sometimes when someone's recounting a trauma or experiencing a trauma, it's in the air. So particularly if you're deeply invested in a relationship with a client, kind of really need to figure out how to shake it off.
I really appreciate that idea of energy, right? That when you've witnessed something so traumatic or gone through with a patient or a person that traumatic, you've absorbed some of that energy.
Yeah.
And so you have to figure out a way to release that energy too. And so I actually really love that, because as you can imagine, physicians and healthcare people aren't super great at self-care, but sometimes when we can use like a chemistry analysis, like energy, right? It's like energy in, energy out.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that.
Well, and even if you're not like new agey woo-woo around energy of how we are all in community with one another on this earth, there are things relative to hormones and cortisol, where even just your stress reaction that's elicited. I mean, I would imagine even the most seasoned physician who's in a room when someone flatlines, I would be hard pressed to think that that doesn't evoke some type of adrenaline response. And then what your body does to kind of calm afterwards, there are things that work better than others as far as getting you back to your baseline. And so even if you don't want to go down the woo-woo route, I still think there's important and evidence-based reasons as to why breathing exercises, some form of meditation, exercise, going for a walk, those are all things that are proven to bring you back to a baseline that you aren't keeping all of those stress hormones just like held in your tissue.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm writing down so many fabulous Tabitha-isms, the woo-woo route and a sandwich of yuck. And like, I'm writing all these down just so you know. Okay. So we're to the time in the podcast where I just ask a few kind of, wrap up rapid fire questions. What is one thing that you think people get wrong about youth with complex trauma?
That it's willful and intentional behavior, that they're making the choice to be bad or to be rebellious. Yeah. And there is some developmentally normal, like establishment of self, pushing against authority that obviously all of us experience at some point in time, but more than that, just like the idea that a young person is choosing to be bad or difficult.
Yeah, thank you. That gave me goosebumps, because I've yet to meet a human being who desires actually at their core to push someone away.
Yeah, yeah.
If you could go back to young Tabitha, what would you say to her?
Oh, wow. Hang in there. There's other people like you.
Oh.
And it's not your fault. And you're going to be okay.
Oh my gosh, there's so many good things right there. There's other people like you. You're going to be okay. All right, everybody tries to make me cry on my own podcast. It's 11 p.m. and you have a food craving. What do you reach for?
Some type of delicious cheese. I'm from Wisconsin originally, so it's in my blood.
If people want to learn more about you or the work you're doing with New Avenues for Youth, where should they find that?
Yeah, if you just go on www.newavenues.org, you can read all about our amazing programming. And I'm just one of many folks that are doing amazing work in our community. And we're on all the social media, so look us up there. But yeah, I am one humble person doing work alongside of a lot of other really amazing, great people, and a lot of amazing young people who, in some cases, once they launch and start their lives, come back and work with us as employees. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tabitha. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate the work that you do for youth and for families in our community.
Thank you.